Hi, I'm Tyler Harris, and you're listening to the Nebraska Notebook. We've got Mike Swingman, Agronomy R&D Manager at Central Valley Ag, back on the show. And as we're recording this, it's mid-March, and prior to the past few days, we had a stint of warm weather here in Nebraska, and a lot of farmers were out applying anhydrous on their fields. And with that in mind today, we're going to be talking about the 4 R's. Mike, when I last talked with you over the phone, you had mentioned, of course, the 4 R's of the right source, right rate, right timing, and right placement, but we have to think about them in kind of a synergistic way. Could you elaborate on that, especially when we're considering the amount of growers that were out and probably are still out applying anhydrous with the amount of time we have left before planting and before the plant is going to use it?
You know, the 4 R's, conceptually they're easy to understand, right? The right rate, right timing, right placement, and right source. When you look at them by themselves, they're pretty easy to understand. When you start putting them together, that's when it gets a little bit more complicated. When we talk about specifically right timing, right? So we talk about right timing, and we talk about one of our biggest influencers on nitrogen loss is really time between the day you apply and the day the corn plant starts really using the nitrogen, and all the things that can happen in between in the nitrogen cycle, the immobilization, the denitrification, the nitrification, the leaching, all those things that can happen is kind of why timing plays this role. And then when we talk about placement, you know, we talk about how we're getting that close to the root so we can get adequate uptake and really get it to where the plant's going to use it most efficiently. And then how source plays into all that is really sources, as we move through different timings and different placements, we have to talk about what source we're using and whether it's the right source for that particular application. And then after all that, we can talk about rate a little bit. So when we start talking about rate, then we have kind of all these fudge factors, for lack of a better term, or adjustments to your nitrogen rate based on timing. So if you're out and your crop requirement is 220 pounds of nitrogen, but you're applying in the fall, we really need to apply 5% more than that. So you're looking, we need to be about 230 pounds of nitrogen. We move that into the spring, and now we start talking about how that's 220 pounds again. Then as we start talking about split applying and everything else, if you look at the research, then we can start applying different factors, and that's how we kind of lower that applied nitrogen number. But that's just using the timing effect. That's not starting to leverage the factors we can apply for placement and then adequate estimate of crop removals based on, you know, that going back that net effective stand percentage and what yield goal we have for a specific zone in your field. You know, rate gets really, really complicated and takes a lot of thought process to get to what the right rate is. And I think, you know, later on in this discussion we'll talk about how that's kind of affected some of the other things we've tried in the last few years to make sure when we're trying to employ new technology, we know it's working. So, but that rate, that intricacy between them all is really what we try to master in our on-farm research, or especially with our nitrogen and water group. That's one thing we're going to try to tackle this year is like, how do you take those 4 R's and use them most efficiently?
Yeah, and I guess what I'm hearing is the rate is one of those things that we have to determine last based on what some of those other factors are that are playing a role into the 4R synergistic relationship.
Well, you kind of calculate rate first, yeah, and last, right? Like you have to go back to what your yield goals are effectively and kind of being able to work through the algorithms and the math of how much nitrogen you're going to need in a rough sense. Mm-hmm. And then start refining that number based on your management style or your management criteria and how the other 3 R's play into that. That's kind of how then you get to a final rate number. But you can't just say, I do this. You know, I side dress 80% of my nitrogen, so that means I get to, for 240 bushel corn, that means I get to only apply 100 pounds. That's not the logic we want to go through. We need to start with the number and work out all the adjustments based on the advanced management strategies we're going to use.
Okay, and a lot of that goes back to what the gut feeling is too, starting out within the original plan. And when we talk about timing, I mean that's one of the big things, of course, that comes to mind that you had mentioned. So When we talk about that synergistic relationship, what are some of the things that growers need to keep in mind when they're thinking about timing and when that corn plant uses nitrogen that's applied? How does the right time impact the right rate and the right source?
So as we start to talk about the right time, right? So if we're go back to that scenario where we're putting on our nitrogen as far away from crop use as we physically can, there's loss in there that we're going to incur, and we don't know if it's going to be 10%, 20%, 30%, whatever. We also don't know what the soil is mineralizing back out, right? And so as we start to move later, we can make better decisions based on what growing conditions up to today have been, what projected growing conditions from here on out are going to look like, and then really kind of what the status from a yield standpoint of our corn is. And this is also going to bring into that discussion of then we can be a little more targeted with our application through technology, whether it be imagery, whether it be NDVI, whether it be however we get that NDVI imagery, airframes, drones, UAVs, use the correct terminology there, satellite, or even thermal imagery becomes into play, or the mounted technologies like crop canopy sensors, and we can start to make that nitrogen recommendation. Now when we think about that, this is where we can really use source and timing to dial down our rate. If we're in a good growing season and we have really good high organic matter soils that have fairly good microbiological activity, so they're really healthy soils, in a good growing season we're going to get more nitrogen out of those soils. So one of the things we can think about is, in our really good soils, can we take some of the nitrogen out of the system, our applied nitrogen, and let Mother Nature supply it, and then take that nitrogen and go to our poorer soils, our less healthy soils, or less active soils, and kind of push the envelope there to make up for the nitrogen that soil's not going to create. That's where the power of kind of that timing comes in. Is up front we have a hard time, like we make those decisions. We can make the same decision, but the problem is we can't calculate what the weather effect has been or what the climatic effect has been. We can make those decisions up front, and 9 times out of 10 we'll be pretty close, but we can be a lot closer at the same percentage of the time if we manage that later out in the year. Our chances of missing. And then, if we get into catastrophic events, we don't have all that nitrogen laying out there, all that investment laying out that we're not going to capitalize on.
Yeah.
So this is a risk mitigate. This is one of the ways that it takes a lot of work, and it takes a lot of management, and it takes a lot of thought process, and it takes a lot of communication, but it's one of those ways that we can help mitigate your risk quite a bit more. And we talk a lot about reducing costs. This doesn't necessarily reduce costs, it reduces risk, but I can tell you it's a conversation that if you're having with your agronomist or your trusted advisor on a regular basis, it is way more important than saving 10 or 15 bucks a ton on any one given source of fertilizer.
Since we know there's a benefit to mitigating risk that way, Mike, what's holding back that adoption curve? And this is one of the questions I've posed to a number of people on just any technology or management practice that we've seen being brought to the forefront. And we see some growers that are applying later, but then there's that challenge that kind of goes with that on the management side. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that today too.
As I've studied the 4 R's over the last year, and I've done some trials, whether it be with nitrogen stabilizers or the models, or even technologies like Y drops from 360 Yield Center, I've kind of come to this conclusion that our initial R is very possibly too high. And I'm not saying that we're grossly over applying nitrogen, right? But we are, when we start taking those things into effect, and we're not putting enough distance between, and we're really not sometimes looking at the right things. We're taking the same amount of nitrogen, we're applying it at different timings.
Yeah.
Right? So it's like if I went home and I fed my dog gets 2 cups of food a day, but I'm feeding it 2.5, but I'm thinking, well, I'm going to feed this 4 times. I'm still feeding a half a cup more than I should, or more than I really have to. If I go and spread those calories out throughout the day, it helps out in a lot of different ways. The same thing happens with your nitrogen program. As we start to do this, we have to really be honest about what we're going to do with rate, because that extra nitrogen masks all the benefits of timing or masks all the benefits of placement. And what you see is you don't see a yield increase, because enough is enough, and a little bit more. If you look at that law of diminishing incremental yield, right?
Yeah.
Like 10 pounds more doesn't really gain you 10 more bushels. It might gain you 2 or 3, which isn't really noticeable on your combine monitor. So we have to talk about spreading that gap out and using these technologies and really try to push that number down to really test the value of it. And so what I did in my nitrogen stabilizer trials over the last couple of years is, instead of running them all at what the grower was running their rate of nitrogen at, I ran them at that 100% GSP rate, or general standard practice rate. And then I turned around and I ran them again at 80%. Because if there was no gap between 100% nitrogen and 80% nitrogen, the stabilizers probably still worked. But to answer your question is, we're either putting too much of a source out there, or we don't have enough sink. We don't have enough plants. We're not managing our population correctly, or we're not managing the nutrient requirements correctly. And so then you can start playing with the other factors. And that's where working with trusted advisors who really understand all those different interactions can say, well, we're not going to change your plant population without changing your nitrogen rate, because those two things are directly intertwined. They're directly connected. So I think it led to, we have to be more prudent and more judicious on how we look at these technologies, and really stress them a little bit, like take them to the very, like push them to the very limit, and see what happens. Because when we take the same rate and we just move it out, we're really only looking at 1 R at a time. We're not doing a 4R look at a technology. We're just seeing if it works.
And speaking of those decision technologies, I wanted to talk a little bit more about that, because we've talked about that over the phone. But when we look at some of those technologies, whether it be remote sensing through UAS, through airplane satellite imagery, or crop canopy sensor data, based on the discussion, I guess, that we've had on the 4Rs, how can some of these tools offer a value or a return to the grower for using them? And also, what are some of the factors that are holding back adoption, and how do we move that forward?
I mean, the first one we have to address is really, how do we justify the capitalization or the monetary value of these things? We're looking at, when we're talking with growers about, on imagery, investing anywhere from $6 to $10 a season for really high resolution imagery. One, we have to decide, like, what's the right amount of resolution. 2, then, like, how do we implement strategies to capitalize that. To 3, how do we capture the information that we made corrections, and then how do we calculate ROI. And I think as an industry, we're kind of in this, we're in this very critical phase with these technologies that the hype is over, right? And so now it's either we capitalize on these technologies and we drive them forward into an implementation plane, or they just start to kind of slide off. Like they slide down, the hype goes away. And a little bit of the hype needs to go away. Like, we need to, some of these technologies, we need to quit thinking that they're going to answer every question for us, and just really ask them to answer the question we asked.
Yeah, it's a matter of not looking at it as a silver bullet, but trying to take a pragmatic approach to seeing how I can make a decision based off of this.
And really not even how I can make a single decision, but how does it enhance my decision-making process, right? Because for the last 50 years, for sure, farmers haven't been wrong, or the yield curve wouldn't be going up.
Exactly, yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
So, and when we look at the course of kind of the major fall-offs of off the super cycles over time, like, we've settled out of crises. Like, the 30 was a crisis, the 80s were a crisis. But if we look at the one in between, in the 50s and 60s, it wasn't near the crisis, because we learned how to get more efficient. We learned how to leverage technology and leverage, whatever we could.
But now we've just got this litany of technologies that are coming to the forefront all at once, too. So it sounds like it's a matter of pulling which pieces of those that we need together collectively as part of a bigger system. Am I understanding that right?
Right. Like if you're a farmer and you go look at your toolbox, right? And not your digital toolbox. Yeah. Go to your shop and open up your toolbox. I would bet in most cases, not all your tools are all company A, company B, company C, company D. You kind of got this collection of tools from different sources. Your digital toolbox and the provider of that digital toolbox, or the person you're working with that digital toolbox, it behooves them to have multiple tools to choose from. And then you find the tools that are right for you and your application and your operation. And then you learn how to use those sets. I don't think we're ever going to get to a point where we're not going to quickly get to a point where there's one solution that fits everything, or a group of one solutions that fit everything. I think you're going to have to learn to navigate between different systems to get the information you need to make decisions. But what that does is there's no black box, right? There's nothing making a decision for you and taking it away from you as the grower. Like when you do that, you're still in control. You control your data.
You're still in the driver's seat.
You're in control of your decision-making process, and you're using the same people you've worked with for years, that same group of advisors. You're just using different information sources or different ways of gathering and disseminating information to make higher-level decisions. You're not giving any one system or any one entity the power to make that decision on your behalf. And I think that's one of the things that we don't do enough in this industry. And that's kind of that fear of somebody making a decision for me is why we haven't had the adoption rate we should have. If we use it as an enhancement to our decision-making process, I think we're going to get higher adoption. And that's one of the things Keith and I have been talking about working on with this group, right? It's like, let's play with this a little bit, and let's talk about how you could use these tools, not how these tools make your life better, not how these tools run your life for you.
Yeah.
And that's the fear, right? That's, at the end of the day, that's the fear of any AI technology, is that
taking the farmer's decision out of the equation, or the thought process of the grower, the boots on the ground approach. It's very much a value proposition, is what I'm hearing from several people, is the fact that we've got to show where the value is, and a lot of that lies in what you just said, and enhancing the decision-making process, and not basing even one decision entirely on one specific piece of technology, but using all the tools at your disposal to enhance the overall thinking and decision-making process. And I wanted to talk a little bit more about the placement and timing factors of nitrogen, and maybe we can talk about how some of the technology kind of plays a role in that, because we hear this phrase, location, location, location. And, some folks might even argue that when it applies, that applies to nitrogen placement as well. And you mentioned the Y drops, but that also has to do with root activity as well. So when we talk about the right rate and source, how does placement kind of factor into those things as well?
Well, I think we're still kicking around a little bit of the exactness of that importance of that timing or that placement. And I think one of it is there's nitrogen does move vertically through the soil. It also, depending on slope and topography and tillage direction and stuff, you can get some nitrogen moving horizontally through the soil. Well, it's not moving exactly horizontal. It's like moving with the slope. It's not moving straight on a horizontal plane, but it's moving it, perpendicular to the slope. And where does that where does that water that's connected to reinfiltrate and resettle? But the thought process is right. If you look at root morphology over time, as an industry, we've kind of built a more of a compact or denser root structure that doesn't really fan out very wide and doesn't necessarily go as deep as it used to in a lot of cases for a lot of different factors. How do we get nutrients, specifically nitrogen in this case, into that most active root zone for the longest period of time? Like I was having a discussion with somebody just last week, and we were talking about the 3-foot soil profile and why we sample 3 foot for nitrates, and we're embarking on a little study that we're going to try to do at one of the 2 of our RD sites. And I said, when we look at capacitance probe and root activity, we don't have a ton of root activity in the 3rd foot in a lot of cases. We have some, but not like in the grand scheme of things, not a lot. But if I talk about real root activity, it's in that top 14 to 22, 24 inches. Well, it only leads me to believe that that's where I want my nutrients to be. Like, that's where the business is going down. And so because of soil temperature and the distance and the amount of energy as plant has to do to pull from deeper, we need to have that kind of where it's the easy pickings.
Where it doesn't have to reach down too far.
And so that's why we talk about nitrogen, moving it closer to the plant so it gets down and it's kind of gets stuck right in where those active roots are. So when the plant's at the highest rate of its uptake, we never have a daily shortage. And that's kind of my 4R strategy, right? Is I'm open to applying nitrogen as many times as you want to apply it as a grower. As much work as you want to put into it, I'm game. Let's go for it, right? But my one rule is that plant can never run short. I'm driving to Tilden later today, and I can drive to Tilden, and I can never have more than a quarter tank of gas in my pickup. But the thing is, I just got stopped more times, so I never go empty. And so we can run that system. Like, we can run on a quarter of on the smallest rate of our total soil holding, the ability of the soil to hold nitrogen, we can put it in 30, 50, 80 pound increments.
So it's a matter of consistency,
right? But just never let it go to zero.
Yeah,
right. And so when we get into the middle of the growing season, corn's using 11, 12, 13 pounds per acre per day. You got to think about, okay, so at best 3 days is 40 pounds. So you got to start thinking about what's the plant using on a daily basis, and then we can start. Then that's when using placement and timing really gets fun. The other thing is, where your active root zone is. You know how much water, dry space you have above that active root zone. And we're doing a fertigation application. We can do the math, and we can tell you exactly how much water to put on based on your infiltration rate, your water holding capacity of your soil. And we can tell you exactly how much water to put on with that nitrogen, not only to get it in the soil, but to drive it to that active root zone. And then calculate when you need to do it to make sure it gets delivered
and the right rate
right rate before day 0 when you run out from your last application, and still be well below what the capacity of the soil to hold nitrogen based on its cation exchange capacity. That is like the Cadillac of nitrogen. That is the apex of nitrogen management today, is being able to take all those things. And that's where all the technology comes into play, whether it be Y drops replacement or fertigation or NDVI imagery and sensors, the capacitance probes to look at soil water, and knowing our ability and digitally be able to visualize how much water we put on, and then in the future being able to do that variable rate with irrigation. That's the frontier. Like, that is the speed racer we need to get to. When we talk about building the chassis, that's no longer your dirt track hobby stock car, right? Like, that is the Daytona 500 winning car right there.
Yeah, that's what everybody strives for.
And you as the driver, like, you being capable of driving that high performance system to the razor's edge the whole time. That's kind of the fun part of seeing it. But knowing that interaction between where the active roots are, where we have to put nitrogen to intercept those roots, and how do we get water to flow to them.
And that takes a little bit of an adaptation process on the driver's part too,
right?
Just to be able to manage all those different systems too and take everything into account.
So, like, every year we're redesigning your car, and we're making it handle a little different. We're making it corners it's a little tougher in the corners, takes a little more brake, takes a little more throttle, whatever you need to do. That's kind of what we're doing, right? Every year we're improving, or even throughout the season, we are making adjustments that makes that chassis drive faster and drive to that point of efficiency where we want to go. my hope is that by the end of the year, when Keith and I get done with this group of growers, like, we have a pretty good vision on how those things interact. Like today, we hypothetically sitting in the cabs of our pickups when we're talking in the morning, we have a pretty good idea on how that whole interaction works. Now it's to go and test it and see what happens. But I think it goes back to that 4R statement, right? Once you understand the effects of rate, and how that interacts with the source, the placement, and the timing, and how to get the most out of every one of those 4Rs, that's where we drive the grower's bottom line. Now, like I said, we got to find the value proposition of the technology, because we can't, like, that technology is not going to ever be free. There's going to be a cost. So then how do we make it so when you're using those technologies, there's a bigger payoff for you in the future? And I think there's going to be some, going down the road, there's going to be some ways for us to get there. But first, we got to start making the technology work for you. And we're going to have some pretty interesting ways to implement those technologies here in the next week or so that are pretty cool. So that's the fun part.
Yeah, and as we've mentioned in the past, there's no one silver bullet that's going to take you from A to B. It's going to be incremental steps over time to achieve those improvements in efficiency and ROI. And that's where some of these technologies, these decision-based technologies, come in. And you can learn more about the interrelationship of the 4Rs of nutrient stewardship as the discussion unfolds in upcoming Nebraska Farmer print articles and on our website at nebraskafarmer.com. Be sure to follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and thanks for listening to the Nebraska Notebook.